Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the 20th century's most complex and frankly brutal conflicts, the Spanish Civil War. This was a war that literally pitted neighbor against neighbor and cast a long, dark shadow that signaled the horrors to come for the rest of the world. So how does something like this even happen? How does a country just turn on itself? To really get it, we have to look at the deep, simmering tensions that have been tearing Spain apart for decades. The battle lines weren't drawn overnight, that's for sure. They were carved by years and years of political and social strife.
Okay, so our story really starts with Spain's Second Republic. It was this bold democratic experiment born in 1931. But instead of bringing the country together, it just became this battleground for completely different visions of what Spain should be. It was an incredibly volatile political tinderbox, just waiting for a spark.
And this right here, this is the core of it. On one side, you had Republicans and leftists who were pushing for a modern, secular democracy. You know, land reform, rights for workers, that kind of thing. But on the other side, you had this powerful old guard, the army, the church, the aristocracy, and they saw all these reforms as a genuine threat to their power and to the very soul of traditional Catholic Spain.
That 1936 election, that was the final straw for the conservatives. When the left-wing Popular Front won, a group of generals decided that was it. They planned a quick, clean takeover. But it backfired, big time. Their coup failed in key cities, and instead of seizing power, they shattered the country in two. And just like that, the inferno of civil war was ignited.
Now this conflict wasn't simple. It wasn't just one army versus another. We're talking about two massive, fractured coalitions. Each side was made up of all these different groups, many of them just allies of convenience, who were all fighting for their own, often wildly different vision of Spain.
So, we can start by breaking it down into two main camps, the Republican and the Nationalists. But these simple labels, they hide a ton of complexity. So let's actually dig in and see who was really on each side. It gets pretty interesting. The Republican side, wow. It was this fascinating but deeply divided alliance. You had liberals who just wanted to save democracy. But then you had socialists and communists who wanted a full-blown worker state. And then you had anarchists who, get this, didn't want a state at all. On top of that, you had Basque and Catalan nationalists fighting for regional autonomy. They were really only united by their enemy. And that internal conflict, that constant struggle over what they were even fighting for, would end up crippling their war effort. The Nationalists, on the other hand, were way more unified in what they wanted, or maybe more accurately in what they didn't want. They were brought together by what they opposed: communism, liberalism, and regional separatism. At its core was the hardened Spanish army, led by brutal officers known as Africanistas. And backing them up, you had fascists, monarchists who wanted a king back on the throne, and the incredibly powerful Catholic Church, which framed the whole thing as a holy crusade. So this is where the conflict explodes beyond Spain's borders. The Spanish Civil War didn't happen in a vacuum. It quickly became a proxy war for the massive ideological struggles that were tearing Europe apart in the 1930s. We're talking fascism versus communism versus democracy, all playing out on Spanish soil.
And this just lays it all out. The international dimension was huge. The Nationalists got massive, decisive support. Hitler sent his elite air force, the Condor Legion. Mussolini sent tens of thousands of Italian troops. For them, Spain was a perfect testing ground for their new weapons and tactics. The Republic's main backer was the Soviet Union, plus those famous international brigades, thousands of volunteers from all over the world who came to Spain because they believed it was the front line in the fight against fascism.
So what about the world's great democracies like Britain, France, and the US? Well, they were terrified of starting another world war, so they adopted this policy of non-intervention. It sounds neutral, right? But it was absolutely disastrous for the Republic. While Germany and Italy were openly arming Franco's rebels, this embargo effectively stopped the legal, elected government from being able to buy the weapons it needed to defend itself. Okay, let's track the brutal progression of the war itself. It was a grinding, horrible conflict defined by long sieges, wars of attrition, and terrifying new tactics that would soon be unleashed on the rest of the planet. This timeline, it really shows the arc of the war. It starts with the incredible, fierce defense of Madrid, then moves to a moment of pure terror from the skies, then to the final, desperate battle that broke the Republic's back, and finally, the fall of the city that had held out for so long. Guernica. The bombing of this small Basque town by Hitler's Condor Legion was a horrifying turning point. This wasn't a military strike. It was a calculated act of terror. It was one of the first times a civilian population was systematically targeted from the air just to break their will. The attack absolutely shocked the world and became this enduring symbol of fascist brutality, inspiring Picasso's incredible anti-war masterpiece. And this quote from the communist leader they call La Pasionaria, it just perfectly captures the spirit of Madrid. When Franco's army got to the capital in 1936, everyone expected it to fall in days. But instead, they were met with this unbelievable resistance. Ordinary citizens, men, women, children, armed with old guns and just sheer guts, held off a professional army for 2.5 years. By the summer of '38, things looked grim for the Republic. They were desperate, so they threw everything they had left into one last, massive offensive at the Ebro River. It was a huge gamble to try and turn the tide, but after months of some of the war's bloodiest fighting, it failed. The Republican army was shattered. It was the nail in the coffin. The war was all but lost. The fighting officially stopped on April 1, 1939. But that wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. What came next would shape Spain for decades. For the winners, it was peace. But for the losers, it was the beginning of a very long nightmare. The human cost, it's just staggering to think about. More than 500,000 people died. And even that number doesn't tell the whole story. You have hundreds of thousands who fled into exile, and countless others who were thrown in prison, sent to forced labor camps, or just disappeared in the brutal repression that followed. With his victory, General Francisco Franco became the absolute ruler of Spain, the caudillo. He completely dismantled the republic and crushed all opposition. What came next was a systematic campaign of political purging, what historians call the White Terror, designed to wipe out any trace of the Republic's liberal and left-wing ideals. This quote, it's just chilling. It gets right to the heart of what came after the war. A Republican officer, locked up for years, asks a prison priest why he's still there, what crime he committed, and the priest's answer is just brutally simple. You lost the war. Guilt and innocence had nothing to do with it. Justice was just another word for vengeance.
So why does all this matter on a global scale? Well, because the Spanish Civil War was, for all intents and purposes, a dress rehearsal for World War II. It was where Germany tested its blitzkrieg tactics, where the world saw the terrifying power of terror bombing, and where Hitler and Mussolini learned a critical lesson. The democracies would not stand up to them. Spain's tragedy was a warning to the entire world. And that leaves us with this one final, sobering thought. The war in Spain was so much more than a domestic conflict. It was a crucible where the tactics, the ideologies, and the political alliances that would define the Second World War were tested and refined. It really makes you wonder, how different might history have been if the world had just listened to the warning coming from Spain?